In the summer of 1795, New York streets fell silent. Shops closed, families fled, and the sound of carts carrying the dead echoed through the city. Yellow fever had arrived, and for weeks, disease ruled New York. The story begins with the late 18th century. New York was growing fast. Its port was busy, its merchants were wealthy, and its population was swelling. But prosperity carried risk. Ships brought goods, but they also carried disease. Yellow fever, spread by mosquitoes, thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the city. The first outbreak in 1795 shocked New Yorkers. Hundreds died. Families abandoned their homes. The wealthy fled to the countryside, leaving the poor behind. The city's economy collapsed as trade slowed and workers vanished. Why did yellow fever strike so hard? The answer lies in the environment. Stagnant water, poor drainage, and crowded housing created perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The disease spread quickly, and doctors had little understanding of its cause. Doctors struggled. They did not know that mosquitoes carried the disease. They blamed bad air or filth. Treatments were harsh: bleeding, purging, and mercury. None worked. Patients suffered, families grieved, and fear grew. Yet some doctors tried to learn. They recorded cases, studied symptoms, and debated causes. Their efforts laid the groundwork for later understanding, though the true cause would not be discovered until the 19th century. Yellow fever revealed divisions in the city. The wealthy fled to safer areas. The poor, trapped in crowded neighborhoods, suffered most. Immigrants, laborers, and African Americans bore the brunt of the disease. This divide created anger. Some accused merchants of bringing disease through trade. Others blamed immigrants. Fear turned into prejudice, deepening social tensions. In 1798, when yellow fever returned to New York with devastating force, the outbreak killed more than 2,000 people in a city of roughly 60,000, an enormous toll for the time. Panic spread quickly. Merchants closed shops, families fled to the countryside, and the city's economy nearly collapsed. The crisis was so severe that officials realized ad hoc measures were no longer enough. In response, New York established a permanent board of health, one of the earliest public health institutions in the city's history. The Board of Health was tasked with monitoring disease, enforcing quarantines, and improving conditions in the city. It marked the beginning of organized institutional efforts to fight epidemics. Ships arriving in the harbor were inspected more carefully, and quarantine stations were strengthened to prevent infected passengers from spreading illness. This was a significant step forward. For the first time, disease was treated as a matter of civic responsibility, not just private misfortune. Doctors did not yet understand that mosquitoes carried yellow fever, but they observed that outbreaks were worst in areas filled with filth, stagnant water, and poor drainage. The connection between environment and disease became impossible to ignore. Reformers began to argue that cleaning streets, removing waste, and draining swamps could reduce the threat. By the early 19th century, the city took small but important steps. Streets were cleared more regularly, drainage projects were launched to remove standing water, regulations were introduced to control waste disposal. These efforts were primitive compared to modern sanitation, but they represented a shift in thinking. Disease was not only a matter of fate, it was something that could be prevented through civic action. The outbreak also influenced the creation of quarantine facilities on islands near New York Harbor. Bellevue Hospital, which would later become central to public health, began to expand its role during these years. The city's leaders realized that hospitals and quarantine stations were essential tools in protecting the population. One detail often forgotten is how yellow fever outbreaks disrupted not only New York but the nation itself. In 1798, when the epidemic struck with particular severity, the federal government was forced to move temporarily. At that time, Philadelphia had been the capital, but outbreaks there and in New York caused officials to flee, scattering leadership and interrupting national politics. The fear of contagion was so strong that government business slowed and decisions were delayed. Disease was not just a local crisis, it was a national one, capable of halting the machinery of the young republic. Another fact reveals the cruel social consequences of misunderstanding disease. During these outbreaks, many white physicians and officials believed that African Americans were immune to yellow fever. This belief was false, but it carried devastating consequences. Because of it, black men and women, both free and enslaved, were often forced into the most dangerous roles. They were sent to care for the sick, bury the dead, and remain in infected neighborhoods while others fled. Their labor was exploited under the guise of immunity, exposing them to the same deadly risks as everyone else. Records from the late 18th century show that African Americans died from yellow fever in significant numbers, disproving the myth. Yet the belief persisted for years, shaping how communities were treated during epidemics. It is a reminder that disease did not strike in isolation. It was filtered through prejudice, inequality, and exploitation. In the summer of 1832, New Yorkers woke to a terrifying reality. A disease that struck without warning, killing within hours, had arrived. Cholera was in the city, and its shadow would return again and again across the 19th century. Cholera first appeared in South Asia, where it had long been known along the Ganges River. In the early 19th century, global trade carried it westward. By the 1820s, it had reached Russia and then spread through Europe. The disease traveled with armies, merchants, and ships, moving faster than medicine could understand. By 1832, cholera crossed the Atlantic. Ships arriving in New York carried passengers already infected. The city, with its busy port, crowded tenements, and contaminated wells, was especially vulnerable. Immigrants arriving from Europe often lived in poor conditions, packed into neighborhoods where sanitation was almost non-existent. When cholera struck, panic followed immediately. The disease was swift and merciless. A healthy person could collapse in hours, suffering violent diarrhea, dehydration, and death. Families watched loved ones die in a single day, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. The speed of the disease terrified the city. The outbreak of 1832 killed more than 3,500 New Yorkers in just a few months. Hospitals were overwhelmed, coffins were scarce, funerals were rushed. The city's rhythm broke as fear spread from household to household.
Doctors struggled to explain the disease. Many believed in miasma, bad air rising from filth, as the cause. Others suspected contaminated food. The true cause, waterborne bacteria, would not be confirmed until later in the century. In the meantime, treatments were desperate and often harmful. Bleeding, purging, and opium were used, but none stopped the disease. The outbreak revealed the city's weaknesses. Wells were contaminated by sewage, streets were filled with waste, tenements were overcrowded. Cholera thrived in these conditions, striking hardest at the poor. Wealthy families fled to the countryside, leaving behind those who had no choice but to stay. The fear was so great that ships were quarantined in the harbor. Immigrants were detained, sometimes blamed for spreading disease. Prejudice grew, but the truth was clear. Cholera spread because of poverty and poor sanitation, not nationality. Officials of Board of Health began to recognize that sanitation mattered. Efforts to clean streets, regulate waste disposal, and improve drainage began. Though primitive, these reforms marked the beginning of modern public health in New York. Cholera would return in later waves, 1849, 1854, and 1866, each time killing thousands. But the first outbreak in 1832 left the deepest mark. It showed New Yorkers that disease could strike suddenly, kill swiftly, and reshape the city in a single season. Why did cholera hit New York so hard? The answer lies in the city's environment during the 19th century. The water supply was dangerously inadequate. Most families relied on shallow wells, many of which were contaminated by human and animal waste. Sewage flowed openly through streets, mixing with rainwater and refuse. In hot summers, the stench was overwhelming, and the conditions created a perfect breeding ground for disease. Crowded tenements made matters worse. By the 1830s and 1840s, waves of immigrants, Irish, German, and later Italian, were arriving in New York. They settled in neighborhoods such as Five Points, where families were packed into small, airless rooms. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Privies overflowed, garbage piled up, and water sources were shared among hundreds of people. In these conditions, cholera spread rapidly, striking hardest at the poor. The wealthy had options. When outbreaks began, they fled to the countryside, believing fresh air and distance would protect them. They abandoned homes and businesses, leaving behind the city's working class. The poor had no choice but to stay, trapped in neighborhoods where death was constant. Entire families perished in a matter of days. The city's leaders recognized the danger, but struggled to respond. Quarantine measures were enforced at the harbor, but they did little to stop the spread once cholera reached the crowded neighborhoods. Doctors debated causes, but without understanding the role of contaminated water, their treatments failed. Bleeding, purging, and opium were common remedies, but none saved lives. The outbreaks revealed the fragility of New York's infrastructure. Wells were polluted, streets were filthy, and housing was unsafe. Cholera thrived in this environment, exposing the city's weaknesses. Reformers began to argue for change. They demanded cleaner water, better drainage, and improved housing. Their voices grew louder with each wave of cholera, and slowly the city began to act. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, was one of the most important responses. It brought fresh water from upstate New York into the city, reducing reliance on contaminated wells. Though cholera would return in later years, the aqueduct marked a turning point. It showed that infrastructure could fight disease, and it laid the foundation for modern public health in New York. Immigration shaped cholera's impact. In the 19th century, waves of immigrants arrived in New York, Irish, German, and later Italian. They crowded into tenements, seeking work and survival. Cholera struck hardest in these communities. Immigrants were blamed, accused of bringing disease. Prejudice grew, yet the truth was clear. Cholera spread because of poor sanitation, not because of nationality.
Cholera struck again in 1849, and this time the toll was even heavier. More than 5,000 New Yorkers died in just a few months. The outbreak spread quickly through immigrant neighborhoods, where families lived in crowded tenements with little access to clean water. The city's leaders tried quarantines and public notices, but the disease overwhelmed every effort. Coffins lined the streets, and fear spread from household to household. The epidemic returned in 1854, killing thousands more. By then, the Croton Aqueduct had been completed, bringing fresh water from upstate New York. Yet many families still relied on old wells or shared pumps, which were easily contaminated. The aqueduct helped, but it did not reach everyone, and cholera continued to thrive in poor neighborhoods. The outbreak revealed the uneven distribution of public health. Wealthier areas benefited from clean water, while the poor remained vulnerable. The most severe outbreak came in 1866, striking at a time when New York's population had grown rapidly. The city was now home to more than 800,000 people, many of them recent immigrants. Tenements were more crowded than ever, and sanitation was still inadequate. Cholera swept through these neighborhoods, killing thousands. This outbreak forced the city to act decisively. The Croton Aqueduct, built earlier, was expanded to reach more households. New reservoirs and distribution systems were added, ensuring a wider supply of clean water. Sanitation reforms grew stronger. The Metropolitan Board of Health, created in 1866, began enforcing stricter regulations on waste disposal, street cleaning, and housing conditions. For the first time, the city had a permanent institution dedicated to public health, with authority to act against disease. Slowly, New Yorkers began to understand the link between water and disease. Though the bacterium Vibrio cholerae would not be fully identified until later in the century, the evidence was clear. Contaminated water carried cholera, and clean water reduced its spread. Reformers used this knowledge to push for stronger infrastructure, better housing, and stricter sanitation laws. The repeated waves of cholera, 1832, 1849, 1854, and 1866, were devastating, but they reshaped New York. Each outbreak revealed the same weaknesses: poor sanitation, crowded housing, and contaminated water. Each outbreak also pushed the city closer to reform. By the late 19th century, New York had begun to build the foundations of modern public health, born from the lessons of cholera. Doctors struggled to explain cholera. Some blamed miasma or bad air, others suspected water. The true cause, contaminated water carrying the cholera bacterium, was not fully understood until later in the century. Yet each outbreak pushed medicine forward. Observations, records, and debates laid the groundwork for modern public health. Cholera outbreaks shaped immigration policy in New York during the 19th century. When ships arrived in the harbor carrying passengers from Europe, authorities feared they might also carry disease. Vessels suspected of infection were quarantined at Staten Island or other designated stations. Immigrants were sometimes detained for weeks, examined by doctors, and kept away from the city until officials believed the danger had passed. These measures disrupted lives and fueled resentment. Many immigrants, especially the Irish during the 1849 outbreak, were blamed for cholera's spread, though the true cause was contaminated water and poor sanitation. Prejudice grew, and fear of disease became a tool for discrimination. The outbreaks inspired reformers to push for change. The devastation convinced civic leaders and activists that New York's infrastructure was dangerously inadequate. They argued for better housing laws to reduce overcrowding, cleaner streets to remove waste, and reliable water systems to prevent contamination. Their efforts led to projects such as the Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842 and later expanded after the 1866 outbreak, which brought fresh water from upstate New York into the city. Sanitation reforms grew stronger, with organized street cleaning, waste removal, and stricter housing regulations. For the first time, the city had a permanent institution dedicated to public health, with authority to act against disease.
These reforms were slow and often resisted by landlords and politicians, but they gradually changed the city's environment. By the late 19th century, New York was beginning to understand that disease was not simply fate, it was shaped by living conditions, and those conditions could be improved. Cholera, though devastating, became a catalyst for building the foundations of modern public health in the city. By the earliest days of New Amsterdam, one disease haunted the city more than any other: smallpox. It did not arrive suddenly. It was always there, waiting, striking in waves, leaving scars on faces and fear in hearts. For centuries, New York lived under its shadow. Smallpox was present in New York from the very beginning of its colonial history. In the 17th century, outbreaks swept through New Amsterdam and later New York, striking both settlers and enslaved Africans. The disease was ruthless. It spread quickly through crowded households and ships arriving at the harbor. Survivors were often left with deep scars on their faces and bodies, permanent reminders of the ordeal. Many did not survive at all. The impact was not only personal, but civic. The city's leaders feared smallpox not only for its high death toll, but for its ability to disrupt daily life. Outbreaks halted trade as merchants closed shops and ships were quarantined. Streets emptied as families fled to the countryside, desperate to escape contagion. Businesses closed, and the rhythm of the city broke. Records from the late 1600s and early 1700s describe repeated epidemics. In 1702, one of the worst outbreaks killed hundreds in a city of only a few thousand people. The disease struck indiscriminately. Children, adults, enslaved Africans, and immigrants all suffered. Churches reported high numbers of burials, and the fear of contagion led to strict quarantines. Ships suspected of carrying smallpox were detained, and travelers were sometimes barred from entering the city.
Smallpox struck without mercy. Children were especially vulnerable. Families watched helplessly as fevers rose, rashes spread, and death followed. Survivors bore scars for life, reminders of the disease's cruelty. In the 18th century, a new practice arrived in New York that promised protection against smallpox: inoculation. The method involved deliberately introducing a small amount of the virus, usually taken from the pustules of an infected person, into a healthy individual. The hope was that the patient would develop a mild case, recover, and gain immunity. It was dangerous and sometimes fatal, but it offered something the city had never had before: a chance to fight back. Inoculation quickly divided the city. Some families embraced it, desperate for protection after watching neighbors and relatives die in outbreaks. They were willing to risk the procedure, believing that survival was better than living in constant fear. Others opposed it fiercely. Many believed inoculation spread disease rather than prevented it. Critics argued that deliberately infecting healthy people was reckless, and some religious leaders condemned it as interfering with divine will. Debates raged in newspapers, taverns, and churches. Pamphlets circulated warning of dangers or praising its benefits. Physicians argued among themselves, some offering inoculation in secret, while others denounced it publicly. The controversy was so intense that inoculation was sometimes banned during outbreaks, only to be quietly practiced by families who trusted the method. Despite the division, inoculation marked the beginning of organized efforts to fight smallpox in New York. It was the first time medicine offered a preventive measure rather than simply reacting to outbreaks. Wealthier families often had better access to inoculation, while poorer communities remained vulnerable, deepening social divides. One notable moment came during the American Revolution. Smallpox threatened both armies, and leaders feared it could decide the war. General George Washington, aware of the danger, ordered the inoculation of his troops in 1777. Though risky, the decision saved countless lives and ensured that the Continental Army could continue fighting. New York, occupied by the British during much of the war, also faced outbreaks, and inoculation became a matter of survival for civilians as well as soldiers.
The practice was imperfect, but it laid the foundation for later breakthroughs. When Edward Jenner introduced vaccination in 1796, using cowpox to protect against smallpox, New Yorkers were already familiar with the idea of deliberate prevention. The debates over inoculation had prepared the city for the acceptance of vaccination, which would eventually reduce outbreaks and change the course of public health. During the American Revolution, smallpox became a weapon. Armies feared outbreaks. Soldiers were inoculated to protect them. George Washington ordered inoculations for his troops, a decision that saved lives and shaped the war. New York, occupied by the British, faced outbreaks during the conflict. Civilians suffered, soldiers died, and the disease added another layer of hardship to war. The turning point came in the early 19th century when Edward Jenner's discovery of vaccination, using cowpox to protect against smallpox, spread across the Atlantic and reached New York. Unlike inoculation, which deliberately introduced smallpox itself, vaccination was far safer. It offered real protection without the same risk of triggering a deadly outbreak. At first, the city embraced vaccination cautiously. The idea was new, and families debated its safety. Some feared it was unnatural, while others worried about side effects. Religious leaders questioned whether it interfered with divine will. Yet, as outbreaks continued, the promise of protection was too powerful to ignore. The Board of Health, strengthened after earlier epidemics, began to promote vaccination. Doctors offered it in clinics and private practices. Pamphlets circulated, explaining its benefits. Wealthier families were often the first to adopt it, while poorer communities remained hesitant, sometimes lacking access altogether. Resistance was strong in some quarters. Rumors spread that vaccination could cause illness or deformity. In immigrant neighborhoods, mistrust of authorities slowed acceptance. Yet reformers pushed forward,
convinced that vaccination was the only way to save lives. Over time, vaccination began to reduce outbreaks. By the mid-19th century, smallpox epidemics in New York were less frequent and less deadly. The scars that once marked survivors became rarer. Families who once lived in constant fear now had hope. One important milestone came in 1816 when New York established a citywide vaccination program, offering the procedure free of charge to the poor. This was one of the earliest examples of organized, government-supported preventative medicine in the United States. Later, in the 1920s and 1930s, vaccination campaigns expanded, sometimes carried out in schools and churches to reach more children. Smallpox left deep marks on New York. It killed thousands, scarred survivors, and fueled prejudice. Yet it also pushed medicine forward. Inoculation and vaccination marked turning points in public health. They showed that science could fight disease and that fear could be overcome. Polio appeared sporadically in New York in the late 19th century, but it was in 1916 that the city faced its first truly devastating outbreak. That summer, the disease spread rapidly through the boroughs, striking children with terrifying speed. More than 9,000 cases were reported, and over 2,000 children died in just a few months. It was the largest polio epidemic the United States had ever seen up to that point. Parents watched in horror as fevers rose, muscles weakened, and paralysis set in. The disease struck without warning. A child could be healthy one day, unable to walk the next. In some cases, paralysis affected the chest muscles, leaving children unable to breathe. Families feared not only for their children's lives, but also for their futures. Survivors often lived with permanent disabilities, limbs twisted, muscles wasted, mobility forever impaired.
The outbreak overwhelmed the city. Hospitals filled beyond capacity, with beds lining hallways and stairwells. Doctors and nurses worked without rest, often falling ill themselves. Coffins became scarce, and funerals were rushed. The city's rhythm broke as fear spread from household to household. By the end of 1918, more than 20,000 New Yorkers had died, part of the global toll that reached tens of millions. The Spanish flu did not just kill, it reshaped society. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, and communities left in mourning. The unusual age pattern of the disease added to the terror. Young adults, the backbone of families and the workforce, were struck down in staggering numbers. This left households without breadwinners, factories without workers, and neighborhoods filled with grief. The flu was not only a medical crisis, but a social one, disrupting the city's economy and daily life. Hospitals filled quickly. Doctors and nurses worked without rest. Beds lined hallways. Supplies ran out. Coffins were scarce. Funerals were rushed. The Spanish flu struck during World War I. Soldiers were mobilized, ships crowded, and resources stretched thin. The war effort made the city more vulnerable. Troop movements carried the virus. Crowded barracks fueled outbreaks. Families faced double grief. Sons lost in war, daughters lost to flu. The city mourned on two fronts. Doctors struggled. They had no cure, no vaccine, no antibiotics. Treatments were limited to rest, fluids, and hope. Some tried masks, others isolation. None stopped the spread. Yet the outbreak pushed medicine forward. Records were kept, patterns studied, and lessons learned. These efforts laid the groundwork for future public health responses. Public health reforms reshaped New York. Clean water reduced cholera. Vaccination reduced smallpox. Better housing reduced outbreaks. Hospitals grew stronger. The city was not free from disease, but it was stronger. It had learned from tragedy. The outbreak created an atmosphere of panic. Playgrounds emptied, schools closed, and families kept children indoors.
Public swimming pools were shut down, and gatherings were discouraged. Newspapers carried daily reports of new cases, fueling fear across the city. Parents whispered about neighborhoods to avoid, and rumors spread about contaminated milk, flies, or even cats being responsible for the disease. Authorities responded with quarantines and strict measures. Children from infected households were barred from attending school. Inspectors visited homes, and families suspected of hiding sick children faced fines. Immigrant neighborhoods, already crowded and vulnerable, were hit hardest. Prejudice grew, with immigrants often blamed for spreading disease, though the truth was that polio was a viral infection spread through contaminated water and person-to-person contact was not yet fully understood. There was no cure, no vaccine, and little effective treatment. Hospitals cared for patients as best they could, sometimes using early versions of ventilators to help children breathe. But for most families, the only options were isolation, rest, and hope. Doctors struggled to understand polio. They debated its cause, its spread, and its treatment. Some believed it was linked to filth, others to contact. The truth, that polio was a viral infection spread through contaminated water and person-to-person contact, was not fully understood at first. Treatment was limited. Hospitals cared for patients, but there was no cure. Some children recovered, others remained paralyzed. Families lived with uncertainty. The 1916 outbreak was devastating beyond measure. More than 2,000 New Yorkers died, most of them children, and thousands more were left permanently paralyzed. The sheer scale of suffering shook the city to its core. Families grieved not only for the loss of life, but for the futures stolen from children who survived with twisted limbs or weakened muscles. Authorities scrambled to respond. Quarantines were enforced in neighborhoods where cases appeared. Children were kept home from school, and inspectors visited households to ensure compliance. Public gatherings were restricted, playgrounds closed, and swimming pools drained. Newspapers carried daily updates, warning parents to keep children indoors. Fear became part of everyday life. Yet, despite these measures, the disease continued to spread. Polio was elusive. Its transmission was not fully understood, and the virus moved silently through communities. Some families tried to hide sick children to avoid quarantine, which only worsened the crisis. Immigrant neighborhoods, already crowded and vulnerable, were hit hardest, fueling prejudice and suspicion. The outbreak revealed the limits of public health at the time. Quarantines and closures slowed the spread but could not stop it. Doctors had no cure, no vaccine, and little effective treatment. Hospitals did their best, but resources were overwhelmed. The city learned a painful lesson. Fear and isolation alone could not defeat polio. In the autumn of 1918, as the World War I raged overseas, New York faced a battle of its own. It was not fought with guns or soldiers, but with hospital beds and funerals. The Spanish flu swept through the city, killing tens of thousands, overwhelming doctors, and leaving families in grief. The Spanish flu began in the spring of 1918, first appearing among soldiers in Europe and the United States. It spread rapidly across the world, carried by troop movements, trade, and crowded transport. By the fall, it reached New York. Soldiers returning from war brought the virus home, and the city's crowded ships, trains, and tenements fueled its spread. The disease was swift and merciless. Patients developed fevers, coughs, and aches. Within days, their lungs filled with fluid, and death followed. Unlike most influenza strains, which typically struck the very young and the elderly, the Spanish flu was unusual. It hit young adults hardest, those in the prime of life. Families watched in horror as healthy sons and daughters collapsed, sometimes dying within 48 hours of the first symptoms.